Hello, Western Civ 105. Welcome to week one. And I just want to say that I am actually surviving this climate apocalypse. Goodness. So I'm able to be in my apartment this morning, but for the last few days I've been staying at a friend's house with the AC. I was born and raised in Modesto, and I thought I was used to heat, but this was terrible and very dangerously just a disaster. So anyhow, it's still warm, but after going through 115, 116 degree weather, this is bearable. So anyhow, I just want to say a few things about the class I didn't get a chance to in the other announcements, okay? So, in terms of the textbook, so I want to say something about this. The textbook is your friend, not your enemy. And I realize some of you don't have the textbook yet. Don't get caught up in needing to read each chapter cover to cover. Now, if you like to do that, if you feel empowered by that, if you're totally into the material, then I'm certainly not discouraging you from doing that. But what I want you to know is when it comes to the textbook, it's mainly to help you out with writing your Sunday papers. And so already I have some students that are already turning in assignments. And Sunday papers, for example. And one student just used the textbook exclusively. That's acceptable. Some of you will exclusively use notes referring to my lectures. That's also okay. So keeping in mind about the Sunday papers again is it just needs to reflect, first of all, answer the question that's being asked of whatever topic's being addressed. And then what I'd like you to do is just make sure that you stick to only content that we covered. So many of you will do a combination of video notes, lectures as a reference point, maybe another link that's in the text, and then the textbook, or however you want to do it, as long as you're just sticking to content that we covered in the module. That means textbook, lectures, and occasionally links to other written sources that I have, okay? So that's that. Let me see. So having said that, I really just want to say a few things about Western Civ 105, and then we'll move on. In other words, I'll just make this kind of brief as possible. For most of you who are students that are taking history classes your whole life in school, you may have been exposed a little bit to Western Civ. Most students are exposed a lot to U.S. History. But I would argue that as a whole, and we're not the only country that does this, we just don't get a lot of quality history classes in our life. And we get very sanitized versions of history. And so I just want you to know that I'm actually extremely passionate about the topic, and that I think that it's important, and I want to tell you why it's important. And what I want you to remember is that I'm not having you memorize dates, names, or anything like that, and I'm not having you doing that in quizzes, because I want you to sit back and I want you to kind of just relax, not worrying about memorization, but to think about the implications of what you're learning. We are covering a more distant history, and we're going to move into the modern world. Now, when it comes to Western Civ, I do a recap because I want us to think about what Western civilization is. So one thing I want to remind you is that Western civilization is more of a concept than an actual location on a map. Obviously West means to be west of something directionally. But ultimately, when you have New Zealand, which is actually more or less in Asia or Southeast Asian spheres, geographically, It is politically and culturally a part of the Western world, okay? But here's something else I want you to think about. China, now one of the competing superpowers. And some are going to say that that's very negative and some very positive or in between, but it's undeniable. They have a communist party in power. The communist ideology they've altered a lot of their economics away more or less into capitalism, which is something we might talk about more, we will be talking more at the end of this semester. But Marxism is from a German Western philosopher. So the reach of Western civilization has been huge. And for the most part, we could say that it's a very mixed legacy. And that's something that I'm going to cover more as we get to the end of this, which is that, here we are in the United States. We're on land that originally was indigenous, Native American. And by the way, it's wild. Now that I live here in Portland, Oregon, there are so many tribes, reservations. I just drove up to Renton to see a friend near Seattle. And all along the way are so many reservation of tribes. And I have friends now that are not just Native American by birth. I mean, they're culturally, they speak the language, they participate in the ritual, tribal rituals and events. And it's become much more something, I was aware of this my whole life, but when you don't live in an area where there are many people living that actually were the indigenous people of this country, you kind of just take it for granted as something that, I don't know, you kind of bypass it in your mind, or you don't quite get the memo on thinking about the implications. Now, living in California and the Pacific Northwest, though, we are the end for the United States of colonial expansion of the U.S. One could call it an empire from that perspective, because we sent out colonies in places that had other people and then claimed that land to be ours. And in the case of Hawaii, and I could talk about Guam and Puerto Rico, but in the case of Hawaii, we displaced the Queen and took Hawaii away from the Hawaiians, and it's now integrated into the United States. We don't always know what to do with this. So sometimes you have now a political culture that's really into canceling out this controversial past. Others want to say, well, that was the past and we need to minimize those actions. I just want to get you thinking about all of that. And I also, what I'm trying to say is that to remember that the United States is a Western European, it's a European project. That when we're studying Western civilization, you're learning about Europe. Why there are white people dominating the history of this land is where did we come from? Where did my ancestors come from? They came from somewhere else, Europe. And that is, and our system of government. Although we changed it, we had a revolution, but the revolution still came out of a European context of thinking, okay? And that's something that I want you to think about. Now, when I went to spend about 3 months in Europe 2 years ago, like before the COVID times, it really dawned on me just how much we really are a part of that legacy. And I think that Americans we like to see ourselves as very exceptional, and we're not as exceptional in that regard as we think we are. But there are some differences, no doubt. Now, again, this is not a U.S. history class, but what I'm wanting you to do is I want you to actually look at this class as an eye-opener for looking at the world that we have now and the state that it's in, because it's going to put much into context. We're going to learn about World War I and World War II from a non-American centric point of view. We're going to take a look at it more of a European. Now look, I teach World Civ, and when I do World Civ, I talk about World War I and World War II from the non-European perspectives more. Okay, so in this class, it's not being Western centric in the sense of saying the West is the best. It's because that's what we're covering. And I think that you'll find that I do this class in a very nuanced way. And what I'm also going to try to do is get you to understand what drama is going on in European politics, modern Northern, Western European politics, and to a certain extent Eastern European politics now. So, and then putting that also in context to the non-Western world and the emerging superpower, China. So that's really all I'm going to say. I realize this took a little bit longer than I was anticipating, but I'm hoping that you're going to be excited to learn about all this information, and that you're going to look at this class somewhat in a philosophical way, in a contemplative way, to think about who we are as Americans, and to say that now America is not defined as an ethnic state currently, although we'd had more of that somewhat in the past. So there's many of us coming from a wide range of different backgrounds. My own daughter, her mother, my ex-wife, is Haitian and Filipino. But yet almost all of my daughter's Filipino relatives have been in the U.S. Navy, while most of my European descent relatives have not been in the Navy. So who's been more invested in America now from that perspective? So just something to think about. In any case, we live in a complex world, and I want to kind of break down the complexities, and I want to be able to do it in a way that you don't feel like you're having a certain ideology shoved down your throat, but you're actually really learning and getting a broad sense about what's going on, so you can understand all of these little conflicts and bickerings going on in the world and within the country that we live in. I hope you are all having a great week, enjoying this class. Keep in mind, last thing to say, I work another job. Sometimes I won't be as available as other times. If you have a quick question, please feel free to text me if it's normal business hours, 9 to 5 kind of thing, okay? And I'll try to respond to you as soon as possible. And so we'll be in touch.